Up next is a presentation by Dr. David Fortin entitled Identity, Diplomacy, and Design. Dr. Fortin is a registered architect, a professor at the University of Waterloo, and a citizen of the Métis Nation. His research investigates the instrumentality of the design process in influencing how we see our futures, with a particular focus on Indigenous voices and agency. Dr. Fortin also leads a small design firm working closely with communities to realize their visions. He is the only person to be twice selected to represent Canada at the Venice Biennale. I apologize for every Italian person in the room right now. I'm looking at you, Adriana, in Italy, and was the first Indigenous person to direct a school of architecture in Canada from 2018 to 2022. In 2022, he was named one of Canada's top 20 aspiring innovators by the Coalition of Innovation Leaders Against Racism. Please put your hands together for Dr. David Fortin.
Okay, good afternoon, and thank you so much, Benny, for your flexibility today, and thank you for everybody for being so patient. I also want to really thank Dr. Thomas for your words. That was really inspiring. I feel a bit like I saw Blue Rodeo perform once after Wilson Pickett, and Jim Cuddy got on the mic and was like, man, that's a tough act to follow. That's kind of how I feel right now. So I kind of am going to go a different direction than I originally thought I would. I really want to talk about the studio. I'm going to end with the studio that I taught last year, and I'm currently teaching a studio on embassies. But I'm going to give you a little bit of a history behind this. I was really inspired by the theme of this because it links into so much of the work that I'm doing these days. A few years ago, this is one of our world's most famous architectural websites, Dezeen, and they invited me to a talk online during the pandemic. And the question was kind of, what is Canadian design? This pops up every couple of decades in our field. It's like, countries have their own aesthetic, but everybody doesn't know what Canadian design is. And the other speakers, talked about our use of wood and, we're an inclusive society. And my talk was predictably more on our relationship with our Indigenous peoples and the erasure of them within our built environment for the most part. So the week after that, I got a cold call from Global Affairs Canada saying, well, Canada's working on our reconciliation efforts, and we have this problem in Global Affairs Canada that we run all of our embassies abroad, and we have no Indigenous people in our office. None of our architects know a thing about Indigenous peoples. And all of our embassies up until this point have been the representation of colonial Canada, and we don't know where to go. So we started this journey together to start to ask some very difficult questions. So I'm going to take a detour. The embassy was already something in a sense that I had been thinking about for a few years. As many of you will know, the image in the bottom right-hand corner, it's called 100 Wellington Street in Ottawa. And this was gifted to the Indigenous peoples as a, I can start my timer. There we go. Sorry, I'm just realizing. There we go. That was my 8 seconds of fame on the national, because as Indigenous architects, we were kind of outraged at this. That building was the US Embassy, and the US outgrew it. And so the analogy I used was, this is the American ambassador comes to Canada and gets a suit made that's tailor fit for him. And he wears it for like 30 years and then, puts on a little bit of weight, too much poutine. And then he needs a new suit. So they hang the suit in the closet for 50 years. And then one day the prime minister says, oh, I know who would look great in that suit. We'll just give it to the Indigenous folks. I mean, the building is a symbol of American colonial politics. It's a style that the US adopts wholeheartedly as symbolic of their might. And it means nothing to Indigenous people. So we kind of went on this rant about it, and then we were engaged by the Assembly of First Nations to ask, well, the Assembly of First Nations was working with other architects, and they were saying, well, what should we do with our building? And they kept giving them ideas, and they were very dissatisfied with that, so they reached out to Indigenous architects. And I was chosen with my colleagues, Aladia Smoke, who's an Anishinaabe Kwe, and Wanda Della Costa, who's a Cree architect and the first First Nations woman architect in Canadian history. And we put together a team to work for the FN to question this. And one of the things that came out of that was this was their plan for Block 2. And they told us that because the building is a heritage building, you can only build tall in behind the building, so kind of in the back alley where the purple is. So they said, you can't touch the building and you can't go outside the property lines, but you can indigenize that part. And we were like, this is the most important building in Indigenous history, and you want us to indigenize the loading dock? I mean, it was kind of outrageous. And so we had an elder on our team as well, Winnie Pinawanakwit. And we just decided as a team that we just would throw out all of the rules that the government gave us. And we proposed this, which was really meant to be visionary more than something that was going to ever be implicated, and it never will get built like this. But we wanted to make a statement with it about Indigenous presence on Parliament Hill and design sovereignty. And, you know, there's a lot of teachings in this that I won't have a chance to get into, obviously, but one of the key ones I would say is that the elder spoke up at some point and said, in our cultures, we honor our gifts. And so we wrap it with glass. We actually don't touch the building. We don't destroy it. We try to honor the building as a gift. And then we wrap it with a wigwam and other symbols. Now, getting back to the studio, so some of these thoughts were already in my head. And it wasn't until just a few weeks ago, actually, and I wish I had another slide, but I think you all can visualize in your head what the Canadian Parliament building is. And it sort of dawned on me that it's an embassy. You know, we've been talking about our Canadian embassies abroad, and all of a sudden I thought, why do we, that is unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin territory. That is a Canadian embassy on Algonquin territory, right? That's not Canada's territory. It never has been officially Canada's territory. So even the way we think about architecture and buildings, the way we describe them, we have to think critically about these things. And I'm going to propose that in Washington too in a few weeks, and I'll see if they like the idea of the Capitol building being an embassy as well. But the students were kind of given this very difficult task because they're non-Indigenous, as you can see. But they all come from very diverse, interesting cultural backgrounds, and that's what made this a very interesting process. And one of the first things that I did for the studio was have them read Niigaan Sinclair's article in CBC a few years ago. You might have read it, where he talks about being locked in the bathroom for 150 years and asking questions about what it means to be a guest in someone's home. So students went back to their own cultures and they wrote these great essays on what food meant to their cultures when they welcomed someone into their home. They wrote about etiquette into someone else's home. And then we read Niigaan Sinclair's metaphor, basically, on someone coming into your home and then shoving you in the bathroom and taking over your home. And then after 150 years, letting you out of the bathroom and then questioning why you're complaining about your bathroom. You should just be happy with your bathroom. If you haven't read it, by the way, I encourage everybody to read that. And it sort of positions everyone about what does it mean to be a guest in other people's territories. So we did go down to Mexico with the students. Global Affairs Canada collaborated with us on this. And I won't read through all of the student quotes, but we visited trying to understand the layers of Indigenous peoples within Mexico. One of the challenges of this studio is not only who does Canada represent in terms of our Indigenous peoples and our voices, but what about the Indigenous peoples in the land where you are? So you have two colonial nations doing diplomatic relations to each other, and neither of them acknowledging the Indigenous peoples on whose land they're sitting on. So we spent some time, we went on a tour of some of these food gardens, which are really incredible, thinking about food and land, the production of things, and how that would impact the students' teachings. We went to a bunch of cultural institutions. And you can see these are all quotes that the students wrote that is included in a publication from this studio. So as the first impression of Canada, it needs to represent a country moving into a future with a distinct relationship between itself and its Indigenous peoples. This needs to be the basis for all architecture of Canadian embassies abroad and develops a unified message for what Canada represents. The next aspect is how the design should be changed to accommodate the third relationship in this, each culture the embassy is representing and the location it is in. So as part of the studio, the students had to do a deep dive into the Mexican pre-colonial to present history. For those of you that have been there, there's a really fantastic museum there of anthropology, I think they call it. So we could dive into that, diagram that, then also understand that Spanish isn't the language of Mexico, of the Mexican territories, and understanding what language groups there are around the country. We looked into the demographics of Indigenous peoples in Mexico City and looking at within Mexico as a country, 6.5% of the population identifies as Indigenous, but in the city, the metropolitan area of Mexico City, it's only 1.5. And it was very interesting when we got down there to, even with the ambassador to Canada, sort of almost negating that the word Indigenous is relevant in Mexico. A lot of Mexicans have this position that it is a mixed country and Indigenous peoples don't really exist because they all identify as being Indigenous to some point. So it's quite a different, it's a very interesting political context down there. Then the students studied trade relations. So this is all stuff that maybe in diplomacy is interesting, and then doing some studies into the site itself. But they did some warm-up exercises that I'll just share with you as well. And this is one that I came up with this one when we were down there. We just noticed there were a lot of food trucks. And so many of the essays talked about food, both from Indigenous cultures. We had a lot of different First Nations and Métis people come and talk to the students, how important food is in our relations. So the students designed these kind of tongue-in-cheek food trucks where they would serve things like the one on the right had things like taco poutine, and how you could merge in Mexican and Canadian cuisines, and what that means. And then I'll just share with you some of the student projects. And so really the aim here, what we obviously came to say is, well, these aren't Indigenous peoples necessarily, the students, but how could we create spaces in an embassy environment where an Indigenous person in the future, we anticipate and hope that Indigenous peoples will be part of the embassies, as they should be. I don't know, right up until now, just you can imagine Indigenous peoples have been art on the walls in our embassies. They have an incredible art collection within Global Affairs Canada. So that's how they say we're pro-Indigenous. We put their art on the walls, but there's almost never been Indigenous peoples at the actual missions, which is also a problem I called them out on. They call their embassies missions. I was like, that's not a very friendly word for Indigenous peoples. But so if somebody does go work in an embassy, where do they do ceremony? Do they know where the directions are? Do they feel welcomed into that space? And so we interviewed a whole bunch of people within Global Affairs Canada, and you can see some of the things here where there is, in this one, there's a green roof, there's a mist circle, a ceremony circle. There's the idea of food harvesting on the site, a medicine garden. And this one was talking, so again, just to relate to Dr. Thomas's talk, the theme on this one is my relative is the land, relational diplomacy in an age of reconciliation. So, giving something, the big theme on this one was, how do you give back to the people of Mexico? Indigenous teachings is not just about yourself and you're inside the fence, but what do you give back to the community, create a space for dancing, for them to enjoy themselves, cool off at our embassy. You can see the smoke coming out of a ceremonial space there, inside the art gallery, creating space for different kinds of art. This one was called In Good Hands. So I'll just read the first one, the first paragraph. In order to maintain healthy relationships between individuals, communities, nations, and land, our environments must enhance our well-being. Such a task begins with our connection to the land, as the earth possesses elements that heal us physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. So these students came up with this idea of the embassy, which I thought was really beautiful, these little sketches, that the embassy should be a space where you feel welcomed and embraces you, but it is also one that reaches out to the community, right? So it has these two different hands, and so they did this conceptual sketch. And then this is what came out of that. And all the students really focused in on sustainable thinking. We talk about 7-generational design. How do you create a building that over time thinks about its water quality, its heat and energy use. We also, by the way, I don't know if you guys know Douglas Cardinal, the Blackfoot architect who designed the Museum of History in Ottawa, as well as the Native American Museum in Washington. We visited with him as part of our process. So you'll see a lot of curving buildings because he really believes in organic architecture. But this building you see, this one ends in a reflecting pond, trying to pay homage to the totem pole and other Indigenous petroglyphs. The land becomes the walls. This was a critique of the idea of the wall of the embassy. This one was about a journey. I'm going to go through these fairly quickly now because I'm just about out of time. But I want to share this one too. And this one is quite interesting in a sense. These students, it talked about it's all about the land. And so their thinking was not just about a building on the opening day of the building, but how do you create an architecture that understands that life will grow beyond it over time? So this idea that, I'll just go to, oh no, it's in a different slide. But you can see on the right-hand side that they're thinking ahead of the building kind of overgrowing. And if you've ever seen Angkor Wat or some of these places, that the natural environment will overtake the embassy one day. And maybe the embassy disappears at that point. They worked with rocks from the riverbed. So they listened to some of the teachings. They took these rocks out of the riverbed at the university here, out of the Grand River. And then they programmed and planned out their spaces based on actual hands-on with the earth in their hands. And then try to create these spaces for diversity and inclusion and factoring in the community. So anyways, this is an ongoing journey. As I said, we're going to be going to Washington this year, and we're going to be looking similarly at our embassy there. And what is Canada's presence moving forward in the United States, and how do we celebrate Indigenous communities and cultures more proudly and within the value system. So I'll end there. Thank you, Marcy.